Mr. Rennie?
Good morning.
Morning, Tom. Thanks for joining us.
Of course, my pleasure.
Tom,
We are now live and recording.
Thank you, Michelle. Good morning, everyone. I would like to call this special meeting of the Board of Education to order. The next regular Board of Education meeting will be held on Tuesday, February 9th at 7:30 p.m. in the board meeting room. Thank you. I will open it up to public comment.
Good morning. If you would like to speak during public comment, please click the participants icon on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Next, click the raised hand option. You will notice a blue hand icon appear in the upper corner of your screen where your face, name, and/or number appears. When it is your turn to speak, the facilitator will identify you and announce that you are unmuted for public comment. Once recognized and unmuted, please state your name and address. You will have up to 3 minutes to comment. Stacy TA, you are unmuted and recognized.
Good morning. My name is Stacy TA. I live at 10 Clocks Lane. I woke up this morning at 4 a.m. because I'm struggling to put my thoughts together as I've spent the majority of my time supporting parents who are trying to process what happened at Tuesday night's Board of Ed meeting. The board and the public will hear more from me on this, but for now, I'm going to take a minute to say thank you first to the administration and all of Darien Public Schools staff for all your hard work and your dedication to our children. Please know, I know your hearts, and I do not agree or believe with what was said and implied Tuesday night. To Mr. Deneen, Mrs. Ritchie, Mrs. Stein, Mrs. Ackman, and Mrs. Parent, thank you for how you handled what happened Tuesday night, for defending the rules and process, and for several other things. But most importantly, for consistently putting kids first. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. TA.
Our next public comment is Joanna Walsh. You are unmuted and recognized.
Wait, hold on, Tara Ackman is not in. She's just texted me and said, is everybody in? I don't know. I don't see her in the waiting room.
She texted me. I just checked. Michelle said she's in. I
don't see Miss Ackman in the waiting room or in, I don't see Miss Ackman in the waiting room. There's no one in the waiting room at this moment.
okay, well, let's give her a second, okay?
Of course.
Yeah. Okay. We'll continue to work on getting Tara in there. Excuse me just a second.
I will be on the lookout in the waiting room for her. Should we continue with, she is not in the waiting room.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Should we continue with public comment?
Yes, and we'll keep working on getting Tara in.
Joanna Walsh, you are unmuted and recognized.
Good morning. My name is Joanna Walsh. I live at 17 Pleasant Street. I have 2 kids at Henley and 1 at Middlesex, and I am one of the co-presidents of the Henley PTO this year. One of my jobs as head of the PTO is to represent the thoughts and opinions of my parent community and advocate on their behalf. And I take this job seriously. I think my PTO peers at all the schools in town take that job seriously. In a normal year, information about the goings-ons about school and the district is traded informally at pickup, on the sidelines of games, on the playground. But as you are well aware, we can't do that this year. So my co-president and I made a formal concerted effort to educate our parent body about the budget process and the budget initiatives through room parent emails, e-blasts, and write-ups in our weekly Wire newsletter. Our representatives on the CDSB Special Education Subcommittee also did outreach. All the feedback informed our decision to support the initiative to elevate SES facilitators to assistant principals. My co-president and I attend every Board of Education meeting, especially during budget season. We have heard CPAC's concerns about the SES change in public comment at multiple meetings. We thought maybe we missed something. So we redoubled our efforts and again reached out to our special education parent community. The feedback was the same. We supported and helped write CDSB elementary speech delivered during the public hearing because it reflected the desires of our parents. Finally, I'd like to speak as a special education parent. This is my 7th year in the Darien public school system, and until this past fall, I had only had experience in general education. That changed for me in both the elementary and middle school. And while my understanding is that things are much improved over the past, I can tell you that the elementary special education is not currently inclusive. It is already siloed. And this is not because my school isn't following the law and not because they're not working hard, their hardest to help my child. It is because it is structurally impossible. My child crosses a bridge back and forth between the general education classroom and the special education services. It is my opinion that changing the position to an administrative level will enable the staff to collaborate in ways they just can't do now. It is a holistic approach, and it is needed to address the deficiencies in the current structure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Walsh.
Julie Best, you are unmuted and recognized.
Good morning. Thank you. Before I start, if I could just mention that Katie Lublin would also like to make a public comment, but does not have a raise hand feature available on her device this morning. I am Julie Best, 38 Red Rose Circle. I'm a co-chair of the Council of Darien School Parents. We know that there's a tremendous amount of support to change the SES facilitator position to an administrative AP position. We know this thanks to the hard work of all of our PTOs and CDSP members who've helped to inform and engage parents and get their feedback. We could have spoken to this at length at the public hearing on Tuesday night, but no one had indicated that there was a need to do so. We will do our best now, but admittedly, we're trying to figure out how to address an already well-covered topic with no indication of what the new or unanswered concern is, or why all the answers that have been offered to date are not considered sufficient. Regardless, we expect you've started to hear from a number of parents on this topic and that you'll hear from more. In addition to hearing an outcry of support for this initiative, we have been inundated with a strong response from parents who feel that the Board of Ed process is broken down. The budget's complex, but following process and order makes it work. But since this cut was announced out of sequence, it created undue complications, raised everyone's stress level, and is making an already difficult process even harder. Relaxing the add cut process means everything in the budget is a potential cut, regardless of what the Board of Ed flags at the add cut meeting. Does that mean we have to state our support or opposition to all things in the budget moving forward? Introducing a cut after the public hearing does limit the public's ability to participate in the process. We know there's public comment before the Tuesday meeting, but board members should not be walking into the room Tuesday evening without having researched, considered, and decided what their position is on the items requiring a vote. The pandemic has created enough stress and complications for everyone. For this reason alone, we should be relying on our best and known practices to simplify the process, not throwing last-minute curveballs. In closing, we understand these are difficult times and a lot's being asked of all of us, but it's just as true to say that the needs are greater than ever too. The Darien Public Schools community deserves the best this Board of Education can deliver. Please do the work, do it together, and keep at the forefront that schools exist for children. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Best. Someone gave me a tip on raising the hand, maybe. If you look at your thing and click on reactions, and that enables you to raise a hand if that works. If not, we'll make sure to get to Mrs. Loveland. I see her hand raised.
Duke, there may be other parents who can't raise their hand if that doesn't work.
I understand that. I just gave it as another option. We'll look for people.
Miss Loveland, you are recognized and unmuted.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Katie Lublin. I live at 24 Maplewood Drive, and I'm the CDSP Special Education Subcommittee Chair. For the past 2 days, I have had very little conversation about anything other than Tuesday night's Board of Education meeting. Even having had so many discussions, I still find it hard to put into words the depth of my feelings on the subject. I am appalled. I am insulted, and I am disappointed. The late cut of the funds allocated to make a change at the elementary level from SESS facilitator to a second assistant principal, while allowable, undermined the public process Darien has always enjoyed. Had this cut been made a week earlier, I believe many parents would have spoken out against it. It was said that further discussion was warranted, but no new information was presented and none was requested. Why then has the 2 months since the proposal was first presented not been enough time? A single remark made that night was offered as justification, a remark that was both highly inappropriate and offensive. By giving attention to something so baseless, 2 board members elevated a dangerous rhetoric. Furthermore, they insult the administrators who put forth, support, and would ultimately implement this change by insinuating that the administrators themselves would be party in the formation of a discriminatory structure. This denigration is unwarranted and unacceptable. In my capacity as special education chair, I've worked closely with representatives from all 7 schools. We have done our homework, followed the conversation, watched and rewatched the meetings, and actively sought out questions and feedback from our communities in a timely manner. Overwhelmingly, we have found support for this initiative and believe that this change will be a positive one that will provide an increased level of support to all students and staff. Finally, I would like to thank the board members that spoke out with resolution and speed against these remarks and continue to hold the Darien Board of Education to a higher standard. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Loveland.
Username Darby, you are unmuted and recognized.
Hi, I don't know if you guys can hear me. I can't seem to
We can hear you, Mrs. Darby.
Okay. I for whatever reason I can't start the oh, okay, there we go. Sorry. There we go. Thanks. Courtney Darby, 23 Old Parish Road. I am a CPAC co-chair. Dr. Adley and Board of Education, thank you for your work, especially during this very challenging year. Thank you also for taking a little more time to review this proposal. I hope in the future you will consider moving AdCut night to after the public hearing. As a parent, I am concerned that creating a special education assistant principal will divide the school community. I hope someone could help clarify just a few points. In my mind, services are specially designed, not administrators. If a child who is struggling in math, who has an IEP, it may well be a general education assistant principal who is a math teacher who can provide the best expertise in its PPT. IEPs are by definition individualized. A PPT is when a group of diverse individuals work together to come up with a plan. If IDEA wanted a group of predominantly special educators, that would be specified. My second point is regarding the current role of the principals and assistant principals. Dr. Adley, I especially appreciated your January 12th comments regarding how much you value being part of PPTs as an assistant principal, and that you would not want that to go away. Under this plan, could you share how frequently general education principals and assistant principals will have an opportunity to participate in PPTs? Will they have a caseload? Will they occasionally pop in? I feel like on social media, there is a lot of confusion about this issue, and it would be very helpful if you could share more details about the percentage of time they will participate. Regarding the Westport case, if you take a quick look at the Westport budget, both of the assistant principals are listed as part of the general education budget, not the special education budget. Is this because they are viewed as supporting the entire community? Do we ever consider this as a district? I understand we are not Westport, but I also noticed that on their title on the Westport Elementary School pages, it is simply assistant principal. In addition, if you look at school districts like New Canaan that have elementary schools with over 500 students, they have one principal and one assistant principal. Ultimately, I do think we should
Almost at time, Mrs. Darby.
do we really need more administrators? If we really want to help our students this year, we know there's been dramatic slides. Should we be focused on services, not administration? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Darby.
There are no more raised hands at this time.
Michelle, can you ask if there's anyone out there that wants to speak that can't raise a hand to just speak quickly and state your name?
If anyone has comments if anyone has public comments and is not able to raise hand with the icon, please speak up.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all very much for the public comment. We will now move into further conversation on the COVID expense RC. Dr. Adley.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you to our board members for participating this morning, and a special thank you to our community members who are up bright and early and participating in the conversation. It's much appreciated. This morning we do have our council with us, Mr. Mr. Mooney, and he's on the screen as you see at the moment. I would like just to update the board on a few follow-up processes we had since the last board meeting. Attorney Mooney is here to talk to the legal requirements, so he will have that opportunity after I sort of share kind of what has happened the last couple of days. So in the original budget, the administration did not put forward and include as a part of its 3.99 COVID expenses. We did delineate expenses under the RC COVID in the budget book, and that was well delineated. It was over $1 million at that particular time. Since then, we had the discussion of what's our fiscal responsibility to the town. We are several months away from the fall, certainly predicting the full year. So I'm trying to get a reasonable perspective on that. If I would have to itemize estimated expenses, there's a few processes that I've participated in the past couple of days. Those included talking to the Connecticut Association of Public Schools Superintendent's Executive Director, the current acting director, the current Commissioner of Education. We all know where our commissioner is at the moment. He's in Washington, but the acting commissioner was able to speak to. I also spoke to the Connecticut Department of Public Health and the epidemiologist there, and our medical advisor, our town director of health, and of course, Alicia. So that's as comprehensive a group and individual discussions and group discussions that I felt would be a useful resource. And the sort of question that was on the table was, just pragmatically, do we need to, is it in the best interest of the district to budget for COVID expenses as part of the regular budget? And if so, what's a reasonable timeframe professionally from their recommendation? I'll say that I think the collective recommendation from all of those discussions and all of those meetings was that it be very reasonable and responsible to estimate such expenses for 45 days, and particularly around the idea of mitigation strategies and physical distancing. So it's with that that I put together a revised list. This is a little bit of the list that we had before. I submitted it to the board. It should be posted online, available to parents this morning on the website. And we looked at the 45 days, and there were things that we took out. That included the additional cleaning at the weekend through discussions with the people I talked about. It seemed that as long as we could continue to do the touch points, they would be most important, and that the weekend cleaning would not be properly necessary. We also reduced some of the LPNs down to 2 LPNs. Talking to Alicia, we felt that we could we can manage some of that, given the number of cases that are happening, how that is actually working. But we still had to put in place the isolation room and then the physical distancing requirements. So it was with that that I projected out with Mr. Rule the estimate for the 45 days, which is 826,000. And you can see sort of how we manage the teaching staff. If we bring the teaching staff in for 45 days in different class sections, I just can't see changing those. They would last the full length of time. So you can see how we modified some things. There's a couple of high school lunch monitors in there. They have campus monitors because we thought we wouldn't be able to hire somebody for the 45 days. So it's a modification of what was presented at the last board meeting. I did point out just a couple of things. We did do a survey of surrounding school districts, and that is attached, and you can see that bar New Canaan, that was budgeting for staffing, substitute teachers and so on. The rest of the districts were not necessarily budgeting for COVID expenses. I will say this though, this process is sort of set in with my colleagues, both in this part of the state and other parts of the state, an interesting discourse about, well, should we have done that, right? And going back to the State Department and the people we talked to here was actually helpful. So I'll just note that. We did note a couple of other things just so as the board has all the information in front of them. You'll get the legal interpretation from Attorney Mooney. But federal grants, if there's any more federal grants that come along the way, we have to just be conscious that you're not allowed to supplant federal grant money. So if we were to spend those issues those items in the budget for next year, they would not be eligible for any potential federal grants that came down. It would have to be above and beyond what was actually in the budget. So that is just something to be conscious about. I did try to delineate a little bit more about the minimum budget requirement. There is a special provision that if you're in the top 10% in terms of the student index or district index, accountability index, that has not been issued since 1819. Darien was on that. You were in the top 10%, so that would have meant, even though we did file for minimum budget requirement, that we did not have to meet the minimum budget requirement because any districts in the top 10% are exempt from that. Having talked to the State Department, they don't know what they're doing with that because it's 2 years old. They don't know how they're dealing with that moving forward, so that remains to be determined. But if you get that dispensation, the minimum budget requirement would not apply. If you don't, it would apply. The only other option would be for legislation to give a provision in there that allows the removal of the COVID expense as an exception, which, if you were asking me, I think that's a reasonable thing that potentially could happen. But again, I can't just sort of commit to that. So it's with that I present itemized estimated expenses for the 45 days of the school year. And we do that for the first, that's basically the first quarter, the fall through close to Thanksgiving.
So just to add on to that before we hear from Mr. Mooney on the legal side of it, I think as we go through this and as we think about this, while our goal is for the safety and the return of our children to school and the safety and health of all the administrators and the teachers in the school, I think we also have to think about the process. And the process worked as of last night with the appropriation being approved for the expenses that have been accrued year to date for COVID expenses. The Board of Finance has said the town is fiscally sound and has the ability to continue to cover unappropriated expenses or emergency expenses without putting the dollars into the budget, which then actually taxes the taxpayers on those dollars. So while it may make sense to put some known items in the budget that we need for the safety and health of the students and the staff, we have to think about the appropriation process. It worked last night. If we need to do it again this year, we will do it. And it's just something we have to take into consideration. The town has the dollars in the reserve fund for just instances like this. So while our focus is on the students and delivering the education to them, It has to be part of the thought process. Yep. So Tom Mooney, thank you for your patience. I will turn it over to you, Mr. Mooney.
Good morning and thank you. As a lawyer, I sometimes have the opportunity to tell you what the right answer is. And in this case, I don't. What I can do is tell you what the framework is and build upon some of the considerations that Dr. Adley raised in his comments. The legal requirement, as you well know, is that the statute 10-222 provides that the Board of Ed, quote, shall prepare an itemized estimate of the cost of maintenance of public schools for the ensuing year. That responsibility involves the exercise of discretion on the part of the Board of Education. And in the abstract, it seems to me to make good sense to look in good faith at the probable expenses. Again, this is an estimate, probable expenses related to COVID, and put them in the budget, excuse me, and let the budget process play out. But there are, in this circumstance, other considerations that the board will want to take into account. A significant consideration is what Dr. Adley referred to as the practice in making federal grants of requiring that the federal dollars supplement what's already been budgeted and not supplant. So there's this paradoxical circumstance whereby districts that put these expenses into their budget may cause themselves to be ineligible for federal reimbursement. That is speculation, and that's why I started by saying there's no right answer. We're talking about an estimate and uncertain legal consequences. But that's something that the board should take into account as you deliberate further on whether and to what extent you should include projected COVID expenses in your budget. And I say whether and to what extent because it's not a yes/no answer. You can say, well, the range of possibilities is from X to Y, and this is an estimate. We have the issues of potential federal funding. So we're going to land here. And that would be where you decide as a board to land in terms of including estimated expenditures for COVID in the budget that you submit to the town. There is in the statute, as Mr. Deneen just mentioned, a process whereby if you have expenses for which you didn't budget, and that could be that things are worse than we hope in the coming school year and that there are significant additional expenses for COVID, the statute does provide a process that you've utilized this year and could utilize next year. And that process is to request a supplemental appropriation. So I'm here to be supportive and answer questions as you might have through the discussion. But I did want to just start with that framework and identify the considerations that you may wish to include in your deliberations as you struggle with the question of whether and to what extent COVID expenses should be included in your budget. I would be happy to answer questions that might arise from what I've just said, or otherwise sit back and wait if questions come up in the discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Mooney. I'll turn it over to Dr. Adley real quick.
Yeah, I just want to add one more variable before the discussion opens up in general. I said it the other night, but perhaps for Tom's benefit, I have a concern that if it's not budgeted, then since this is a priority, this is health and safety for our kids and for our staff members and generally for the community. I'm concerned if it's not budgeted, I may have a responsibility not to fund the things that we've been talking about in the budget. Because we don't know how that's going to play out, and we have to do the health and safety first. So I'm worried about that impact. But with that, I'll turn it back to the board chair. I just wanted to make that as a consideration.
I will open it up for board questions. Mr. Sini.
So Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Mr. Mooney, for being present for this. I think it was a interesting issue that was raised, and it's an unknown environment. So I think this meeting is going to be very helpful in determining our strategy. I look out, and we still have 7 or 8 months before our fall semester begins. I realize we're going to start to have to make decisions sooner than that related to, what COVID's going to look like in the fall. But as this plays out, as this winter ends and we look into spring, we're already seeing a lot of variations in guidance, how we're operating. Just this week, National Association changed the designation of how we're going to look at sports. So it is a very, very fluid situation. And I understand, the fact that, as Mr. Mooney said and Dr. Adley said, that while utilizing RC 28 to create a pool of reserves, essentially to address those unknowns, it's reasonable by, the Connecticut Association of Superintendents, the State Department of Health, and the State Department of Education. I question if it's optimal. I think that's something that we, need to continue to ask ourselves. And as Mr. Mooney said, that Connecticut General Statutes outlines the process of which, one, clearly the school board cannot exceed its appropriation as it expends its funds. So this year, we did not, and Rich, correct me if I'm wrong, but we did not come close to exceeding our appropriation. Now, with the good work of Dr. Adley and Rich, we've been able to do a number of, I would call it almost gymnastic moves in the transfers within the budget, again, which the statute allows us to do. And as was recognized last night and throughout the whole process with the Board of Education, it was very transparent, very diligent, and very, very effective this year in meeting that shortfall versus our budget. But again, we didn't exceed our expenditures. Now, I think that our chairman also brought up the fact that creating a reserve outside the bounds of the general reserves of the town of Darien, we limit the whole entire town and its ability to effectively and efficiently manage those reserves. I do realize that, there is an extra step as we're starting to, go down the path last night, and having to access those reserves by making a formal request to the Board of Finance, then they go to the Board of Selectmen for an administrative role, and then ultimately to the RTM. But as we witnessed last night, that process is playing out. And as Duke reiterated, I gather we have the support in that process going forward if we have to access funds. I'm distinctly interested in, perhaps Mr. Mooney can answer this. Dr. Adley, thank you so much for the memo. It's been, it's very helpful. But when you look at the districts that are budgeting for an extension of COVID in fiscal year 22, only one district has been deemed to have done that out of 20. So I kind of question why we would want to be an outlier in that long list of school districts, regional school districts. And I do understand we have budgeted for some COVID within the operating budget, which is consistent with, I guess, 3 other schools, as noted by the memo. So when I'm done with my last couple points, Mr. Mooney, if you could answer that question, why so many school districts have gone down the path of not including the COVID, budgeting for COVID. I think the most new and relevant information is about this federal grant process, and it only allows COVID for grants for COVID items outside the budget to be eligible for reimbursement. So this is what, again, there's been many inconsistencies in the COVID era, but the question that comes up is why would we want to put significant funds in our budget that would then eliminate them for consideration for federal reimbursement grants? And if I'm not mistaken, we collected almost over $1 million in grants, not all of them federal, but significant amounts federal. And that's why there was a reduction in the amount that was approved in last night's Board of Finance meeting. I mean, I think the last grant came close to $600,000. That's meaningful. So I know it sounds silly that we have to rely on that process to access federal grants, but I don't want to put ourselves at risk and in essence, perhaps shoot ourselves in the foot. And lastly, my last point is the MBR formula, and there seems to still be some uncertainty for fiscal year 22. I realize that's probably a low risk issue, but something that we should also consider. So thanks for all that time, and appreciate it. Mr. Mooney, if you could answer that question.
Well, I'll answer the question. I'm not sure to your satisfaction because the budgeting process in other towns is up to what they want to do in the other towns. And unless they ask me what's legal, I'm not involved. So I haven't actually had any other questions on this. I could just offer speculation, identifying it as such. And that is that towns have a normal process for budgeting, and you look at your enrollment and you look at your fixed contractual costs and you build those costs into the budget and you move on. We're in an extraordinary time with this unique challenge relative to COVID. And in the budget process, these other towns apparently did not address that. So that's, you're to be commended for your thoughtfulness. However you come out on this, you are considering an important issue. All we can do is, you're estimating in an uncertain time. And the issue of supplant versus supplement is very significant, but we don't have a relief package yet. We don't know exactly what it's going to say. All you can do is make your best guess. And the concept of supplanting versus supplementing is fairly common in federal grants. So that's a legitimate concern, but it's not a definite one way or the other. So that's the best I can do to answer the question.
And sorry, just one follow-up, Duke. The other thing I wanted to mention is I know this appropriations process, happened in January and February this year, but it's my understanding, if Dr. Adley, realized in July or August, as we did last year, actually, we could start that appropriations process much quicker. I mean, that can be done at any time. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks for all your time, everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Mooney. Thank you, Mr. Sini.
Can I just clarify?
Dr. Adley.
And certainly don't mean to be controversial, Mr. Senior. So I'm just, and it may be semantics, but I never suggested creating a pool or a reserve. It may be just semantics, the use of the words, but I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, that's how I'm sorry. And I didn't, you were asked to create this list by the board.
Okay,
your original budget did not have this list. I view the reserve, given the unknowns, we have no idea what the fiscal, what the next school year is going to look like. So I view this as a pool of reserves, if you will.
Thank you, Mr. Sini. Mrs. Achman.
Morning, everyone. Mr. Mooney and Dr. Adley, I think my question is a two-part question. If we plan and we know that we plan to have something like the COVID hotline in place beginning in September, can we know that it's going to be in place and not budget for
it? If that's the question, the answer is it's not consistent with the statute in that if you have a known expense as opposed to unknown, expenses that you will incur because you're dealing with something that happened and today you don't know if it's going to happen, then that's the part of the estimation process that is certainly appropriate to say, well, we'll deal with that if and when. But if you are looking ahead and know at this point that you're going to have, for example, I think you mentioned the COVID hotline, the statute charges you with a responsibility. How you exercise that responsibility has some discretion, but in my mind, there's no particular logic to knowing an expense is going to be incurred and not including it in your budget, because after the appropriation is made, you're going to have to adopt a final reconciled budget where you know what you have to spend and how you're going to spend it. as Mr. Sini mentioned, you have the right to move things around. But at the beginning of the year, when you know you're going to have this expense, then that should be an item in your budget as you go forward. So you're making decisions along a continuum. And the far side of the continuum is we know it's going to be in the budget. If that's the circumstance on a particular expenditure, then it is appropriate to include it in the budget.
So I guess my question would be, and I think what the board should be considering is, Dr. Adley, if you tell us that something, and I'm just picking this as an example, like the COVID hotline is going to be in place.
Good example.
Then I think, okay, so let's just, I'm going to make it simple and then, so Doctor, would you anticipate that the COVID hotline will be in place in September, Dr. Adley?
So based on the information that I got over the past couple of days, yes.
Okay, so I guess my thing is, I think as a board, what we should be doing is planning for that which we can reasonably know, right? And I understand and I appreciate the administration coming forward saying, after talking with everyone, it's reasonable to look at the first 45 days of school when we were looking at the first 90 days of school. But I do think the idea that we have been through a school year with COVID, we plan and we want to open our schools. We know that there are certain things that must be in place in order to do that is reasonable for this board to take up. And I don't think with any other topic do we say, oh, there might be a federal grant someday. We plan for that. We put money into programs. And if there's a federal grant, we do the best we can to ease that burden. But there is a lot of unknown, and we're not asking to plan for the unknown. We're asking to plan for the known. So if there's something like the COVID hotline we know is going to be in place, we should be budgeting for it.
Thank you, Mrs. Achman. Mrs. Ritchie?
So I was one of the individuals that brought forth these COVID expenses because I was concerned that, well, first of all, I want school in person in the fall, if that's possible. And if there are mitigations, techniques that remain in place, then we need to budget for that. And I think based on what I'm hearing from Dr. Adley and the conversations that he's having, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but these estimates that you have given us, these are reasonably expected costs that we will need to incur to have full in-person learning in the fall. And I think I'm a little concerned as we talk about grants, because we don't know what lies out there in terms of grants. And I am struggling with modifying a budget because we believe there's a possibility of a federal grant. I feel very strongly if we have expenses we may incur, they need to be budgeted. And if the Board of Finance gets our budget and they don't agree with the way that we have outlined it, then that's up to them to decide if another course of action is more appropriate. But from my perspective, it's my responsibility to budget appropriately. And if Dr. Adley and administration feel strongly based on the conversations that they have had, that these are expenses that are necessary to have full in-person learning or the hybrid model come fall, then I'd like to hear, I guess, from Dr. Adley if any of these expenses are flexible or not, because I'm confused.
Listen, there's varying opinions on this. In the budget book, I did not bring just to be very clear, I did not bring as part of the 3.99 other than some incidental COVID expenses. I did not bring the COVID expenses forward. I did delineate for the record in the book under RG 28 the expenses that we would incur. So you can see those if that was the case. It's not a clear cut. This is not a clear cut decision in many ways, to be honest with you. Sometimes in life, you want to be an outlier. Occasionally, it's a good place to be an outlier. I will say, and I say this for a contextual thing, this has engendered a lot of discussion behind the scenes with my peers, both in this part of the region and in other parts of Connecticut. So I don't know how much other districts are really delving into it to the level that we are. And in some ways, you may be leading as opposed to being an outlier. But with that, I'm still giving you, I'm not going to pretend that this is a good faith worked up estimate through our staff. I still don't have a crystal ball, but based on what I was told, I would be saying that based on what I found out, it would be responsible to plan for the 45 days. That may not play out. It may even get worse. I mean, I don't think you would expect me to sit here and say, like, I know everything that's going on there, but the best information I have to inform you of that, and I'd say I have to plan for the 45 days. Now, whether we plan it politically, practically through one vehicle, but certainly it should be planned for.
I saw Mrs. Stein had a hand.
Sorry, my questions were asked, but I guess I would just reiterate first, just to clarify, Mr. Orsini you said that these weren't in the original budget. They weren't calculated on the bottom line, but it was, put in as an RC for a deliberate reason. So I would just echo the sentiments of Tara and Deb. To me, I think we have to do something, and this seems like a minimal amount relative to what you had in RC 28 to protect us and be able to open our schools, because that's our goal. We just want to get schools open and get kids back in the fall with any mitigation you guys need. So I support the 45 days.
Thank you, Mrs. Stein. Mrs. Parent.
Thank you. The thing that just stuck out to me as I'm rereading the memo is it says only items outside of the budget that were unanticipated are eligible for reimbursement. We are anticipating that these extra teachers, these extra PE, that's anticipated. So I'm kind of struggling of how we could even go after these grant monies if we are indeed anticipating these extra expenses. And I'm clearly not a member of the Board of Finance, but I'm wondering if there's a vehicle for them so this money could be out of the general fund and not in our general appropriation without us going back for the entire process. But anyways, I'm just wondering if there's a way for them so we could have those monies but not tax the taxpayer in a more efficient way.
Thank you, Mrs. Parent. Mr. Brown.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning, Tom. I had a couple questions while you're here, if you don't mind. The first is there's been an issue raised about personal liability for board members should we wind up in a deficit situation. And I'm looking at a little light reading by a guy named Tom Mooney. It talks about this issue. And it says that there is potentially theoretical personal liability, but there's also a right to indemnity for board members. So as a practical matter, is that really a concern, or is that something that's just a mismatch in the way the statutes are drafted? The first question, I think I have 3 points I want to hit, if I may.
Answering the first question, well, I'm interested to hear what I had to say, and I'm happy to say I agree with that. The bottom line is that board members have to act in good faith. If you act in good faith and there's unanticipated situation expenses and you didn't budget for them and you're heading toward a deficit and you do your best to mitigate the deficit and you ask for a supplemental appropriation, which is part of the process, and that appropriation doesn't come through, there is a potential issue there. But the public policy in favor of protecting people who serve their communities is extraordinarily strong. And so there is a certain circularity. The indemnification provision in the statute says you're indemnified as long as your actions aren't wanton, reckless, or malicious. If you act in good faith and end up somehow with a deficit, and in my 40 years, I haven't experienced that, at the end that there are political decisions to make, but ultimately boards can't operate in a deficit and municipalities respond accordingly. But in the hypothetical circumstance that you act in good faith and you end up with a deficit anyway, number one, someone would have to claim that you have a liability. And if that doesn't happen, there's no issue. And if someone claims there's a liability under the indemnification statute, you're indemnified and you have no personal liability as long as you acted in good faith.
Got it. So the next issue I was going to have was on standard of care, which you just opened up a little bit. You mentioned good faith. The fact that we're not personally liable, I'm guessing we don't operate as fiduciaries. I would think our standard is more akin to the business judgment rule as board members. Could you speak to the standard of care we have?
Well, I'll tell you what I know, and I don't want to profess to have more expertise in those particular standards. I would just circle back to the acting in good faith, and if that is the business standard judgment, or however you described it. That would be my description. You don't have, you have a responsibility to act in good faith. And so those legal distinctions between responsibilities as a fiduciary, I think those are concepts that apply in other contexts where a person has the duty to act on behalf of someone as opposed to arm's length transactions. Well, through your service to your community, you act on behalf of the community. And so you do have a fiduciary responsibility, but you're never in a situation where your self-interest could compromise your fiduciary responsibility, because sadly, you don't get paid to do this job. So when you take certain actions, you don't benefit financially. So I don't think the fiduciary rules have particular application here.
Okay. And then again, going back, good faith you mentioned, but you know, acting recklessly or with malice, I mean, there's a big gap in my mind between good faith and acting with malice. I mean, that, okay, so.
I would say that it's really hard, and these may just be semantics until we're in court and some judge decides, but it's a very high standard. There's only one case in Connecticut history where an employee, not a board member, there's no case where a board member has been personally liable for serving a community. In the case of the employee had clearly done wrong and was denied indemnity, but that's not the circumstance here. And so as long as you exercise your responsibilities in good faith, I have zero concern that there would be personal liability.
Thank you. And then the last question I had, I know we have a lot of uncertainties here, and we're trying to make reasonable judgments as terms of what could happen in the future. When we look at that, you mentioned that things aren't certain in terms of another grant, but looking here and trying to be reasonable, if we go ahead and plan for these, we foreclose receiving federal grant money. That would be a reasonable conclusion.
It would be a reasonable speculation, and that's because we don't know the terms of the federal grant. It is very common that federal funds are provided to supplement and not supplant responsibilities, but we're in a in pandemic and unique circumstances, and there are certainly public policy arguments in favor of not penalizing people who are prudent and not applying the normal rule against supplanting budgeted funds. But it's a reasonable speculation because we just don't know, and that is an established principle in federal reimbursement.
But if we were going to go on past experience, that would be a reasonable conclusion. The wild card now is because of the nature of the pandemic, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Mr. Brown. Thank you, Mr. Mooney. I saw Mrs. McCammon's hand.
I appreciate that there's a sort of a legal and philosophical side. I have a more practical question. I understand, of course, the budget process and what that would look like. Alan, if we did choose to not use the budget process as the funding mechanism, can you walk us through what you would need and when as a superintendent, please? What would be your ideal appropriation process if we used that?
Well, to some degree, it would be the same, Ms. McKemmon, as if we was part of it. It depends on how much of this actually comes to fruition. So at the start of the school year, I mean, the staff would have to be in place. I mean, that's the big thing, right? So I'll just focus on that. We would need to have the staff in place. We would need to hire people. The additional sections we would need in place. The additional supervision we would need in place. So those, I mean, we'd need those relatively right away, and that would be relatively a commitment to those things for the duration. Sure, certainly for the classroom sections. I mean, those are the main things. I mean, most of this is going to have to kick in pretty much immediately, and then therefore incrementally after that. But the big things of the elementary teaching sections being in place for the entire time, that would be a decision you would make. I mean, I would be making those. I'd be trying again to look at what the metrics are saying, what people are saying throughout the summer, but I'll be planning to okay, let's hire these people, because that's what we plan to do.
Thank you, Mrs. McCammon. Mr. Sini.
Just a quick one. It is sparked by something Mr. Mooney said. He said, we have the fiduciary responsibility to the community. So when I think of that, and it was a point I made, I think, at the last meeting, would it be proper to bring a broader sense of our community for those who are responsible for budgeting? And when I say that, the Board of Finance and the RTM representatives into this discussion and better understand what those bodies would recommend, given that we are trying to act in the best interest of our community as a fiduciary.
Thank you, Mr. Sini.
That was a question, if it would be proper process to bring those people in to Mr. Mooney.
That's within your reasoned judgment. You have a deliberative process. You're engaging in it now. If the board as a whole decides that you would benefit from further information by engaging those bodies in further discussion at this point, that would be a judgment that you're free to make. I would just take this opportunity to emphasize that as you struggle with these competing considerations, communication is key. Dr. Adley mentioned the issue of health and safety. You're going to have to make a decision. Are we going to include the expenses, or are we not going to include the expenses, and or somewhere in between? But whatever that decision is, if to the extent that there are potential expenses that you don't include, it would be appropriate to identify those expenses now and communicate those expenses so that the town would not claim surprise later. So whether you budget them or identify the potential expenses, it's important to communicate with the town bodies. Whether you wish to bring those town bodies into these deliberations is a decision for the board.
So Duke, just as a follow-up, that's something that I would recommend, that we bring the Board of Finance and the relevant RTM committees into the conversation. Might have to be another special meeting. But Mrs. Parent said something very interesting, question about holding reserves outside of our budget. And that would be like a perfect question we could follow up on with them in such a meeting. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Sini. And as I said during the beginning of the meeting, the Board of Finance has followed this process that we're going through right now through our board meetings. And I think through the appropriation process, made their commitment to continue to work with us on these COVID expenses, and have reiterated the town's ability to pay for these expenses over and above an appropriation or emergency expenses, with their concern being, how much do we want to tax the taxpayers? So I think there's been plenty of conversation over the last few months around town reserves and the dollar amount in those reserves. So the town is fiscally managed very well. And as I think the Board of Finance has made clear through the appropriation process, that is a vehicle, and the funds are there for emergency and outside of appropriation expenses. But yes, we can continue the dialogue with those Board of Finance and the RTM subcommittees in the RTM.
Hey, Duke, that was a formal request, just to be clear, for a meeting.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Sini. Mrs. Stein.
I would just, responding to John, your suggestion with the other boards, I would just remind this board, we are in the middle of a budget process. Our process is we opine on our budget. We as a group of 9 decide what we want to put forward. And then at that point, we can have those conversations. And given that RC28 is included in this budget, I think we have to grapple with these issues first, discuss them, figure out where we come out, and then approach the other town bodies. I think it mucks the water when we do that prior to our own process of figuring out where we stand on this. That's my opinion.
Mrs. Ritchie.
Thank you. I agree, Ms. Stein, and I would just like to mention that FMB has weighed in on this, and the majority of their committee agreed with the budgeting of the COVID expenses. And I would say there is a process. On Tuesday, we vote for our budget, and then it goes to the Board of Finance. And it is absolutely their authority to decide how to structure this request. Then they can reject it, they can reduce it, they can make an appropriation. That's up to them. Our job is to put forth a budget that is appropriate to open schools come the end of August. It is not our responsibility to decide how to structure that appropriation. So I would say there's a process, and on Tuesday night, we vote for this budget and we give it to the Board of Finance, and maybe this Board of Ed does not vote for COVID expenses, and maybe we do. But at the end of the day, it is the Board of Finance and then the RTM that decides how to structure the funding.
Mrs. Hoffman.
All right. So a little bit of echoing what Mrs. Stein said. To be clear, our responsibility is to bring, or our mandate is to bring forward a fiscally responsible budget that pushes education, puts the best interest of education of the district first. So I think that it's everyone's goal, or I should speak for myself. It is certainly my goal that schools are open and full in person in September. If all of a sudden we need to divert funds, and we've talked a lot about remediation, recouping, education, what kids need going forward, if all of a sudden, because even though we know we have these expenses, in order to have an artificially low budget increase, we start transferring and diverting funds from educational resources and or have large class sizes or inappropriate class sizes so that we have to hire teachers, I think that we are really not putting the best budget forward for this district. That is our job. How to figure out how to pay that is the Board of Finance's job. And the RTM has ultimate say on whether they actually agree with spending that much money. There is a reason this structure is put in place. There is a reason. It is like you have different branches of government. We need to do our job. We certainly can work together once this is our budget with the Board of Finance if they have questions or they want to understand what the need is. But the 9 of us have to make a decision of what is in the best educational interests of the children of Darien. That's why you're in for the Board of Ed. That's why you are elected. We do that in a fiscally responsible way, and that's what we're debating now. What is most responsible? But I cannot responsibly say, with a superintendent telling me he can reasonably anticipate that these are the costs to open school, not putting them in, or saying, well, we'll go for a special appropriation, we'll just transfer money from other areas. Those other areas we are saying are important. So if we're gonna say, kids, sorry, we didn't wanna have a high budget and taxpayer, so now education's gonna be stalled for a little while, I'm not comfortable with that.
Mr. Maroney.
I want to go back to the question on a potential grant from the government on this. Is that I'm a little confused on the difference between opining and budgeting on this. Now that we are opining that these may be potential costs, does that preclude us from getting a grant? Possible.
Go ahead, Mr. Mooney.
Yeah, the principle of supplanting versus supplementing applies to the final budget as adopted. Your identification of these expenses through this process is not dispositive. It would really depend upon the final budget and whether the expenses are included in the final budget.
Thank you.
Mr. Brown.
Hi, thanks. A couple more questions for you, Tom, that were raised just on some other conversation. You talked earlier about good faith, and then you had also mentioned in discussing with Mr. Cini using reasonable judgment. What's the distinction there, if there is?
I did not intend to draw a distinction.
Okay, thank you. And then the other thing, if you indulge me for a second, I'm just going to read a brief snippet from Chapter 170, Section 10-222. There's a sentence in there, and I want to give you the whole context, though I should, but the one sentence says that expenditures by the Board of Education shall not exceed the appropriation made by the municipality. There's a comma. Sentence continues, with such money as may be received from other sources for school purposes. So I read that, and in this context here, where we're talking about federal grants, we can expect the appropriation from the municipality, But the way the statute's written, it contemplates you can get money from other sources. Maybe that's a car wash or a grant or something else. But in this process, you can think beyond just the municipality making an appropriation, the way I read this sentence. Would that be correct in your estimation?
Yeah, absolutely. I would describe it as what dollars are available for expenditure, and the municipality has a duty to appropriate funds for the operation of the district. But and grants come in different forms. Some go to the town, and then it should be part of the appropriation. Some grants go directly to the Board of Ed, and those direct grants supplement the appropriation, and the board has the legal authority to expend the appropriation plus the additional funds directly granted to the school board.
So in the contemplation of the budget, it's not simply the municipality. I can think about other sources when I go through this process.
Yes, you can.
Thank you.
Mr. Sini.
All right, I'll try to make this the last one. I guess it's just a simple question. We went through the process of, again, not expending beyond our appropriation in this fiscal year, and it took, a number of different transfers. But I'm a little confused about the concern of not meeting the students' educational needs in a similar manner than we did last year. Again, not coming close to expending beyond what we were appropriated.
Thank you, Mr. Sini. Mrs. Ahmed.
So I'll answer that. If all of a sudden, if we don't plan for these teachers and we are in a COVID situation and we don't have staff, what do we do? If we say that we believe certain things in this budget are necessary to move forward, and we have to transfer money to cover PPE and such, then health and safety, as Dr. Adley, takes precedent, because the first thing we've always said is we need to keep our students safe, and we certainly care about their health. And so yes, this year was different. This year, when we were contemplating a budget at this time last year, we had no idea what the opening of schools would look like. We now have somewhat of a template. It's not perfect, and hopefully it's going to get better. Hopefully we are not in remote. We are not in hybrid. But what I would hate to say to parents is, we don't have enough staff to open schools safely. We knew that we could reasonably anticipate having a COVID hotline, but we didn't budget for it. So there's no money from it. Or I have to pull $20,000 from teacher in residence, and I can't put that in because I now need a COVID hotline. I don't want to start making those trade-offs. I think that we need to put forward a reasonable budget. I think we can put constraints around this. I think this year we trusted the Board of Finance. And I think what we're asking from them next year is to trust us. I think I said the other night, I'd be more than willing to talk to them and say, this RC we will track, we will make sure we return. It is only used for this. I think as a board, we could make those guarantees. But I think we have to be nimble. I think we have heard how passionately and how important it is for kids to be in school. And I don't want to be caught unaware come September, because we were worried about artificially coming to some artificial number in the budget. I think how we pay for that as a town and a community, to Mr. Sini's point, is the Board of Finance's job and responsibility. I trust they will find a way to do that. Should they go to reserves for that? Should they tax for that? Should they decide to fund it but do a supplemental tax? Those are all things out of my pay grade. That's their job. Our job in the 9 is to put the best budget forward that is responsible and moves education forward in this district.
Mrs. Parent.
I just want to echo that a little bit. And to Tara's point about the timing, last year, I was not a part of the board then, but you guys had no idea what was coming. And now we do have an idea, and we've been told by our superintendent, who has been in consultation with other experts, that these are reasonable expenses to expect to be able to open school in August. And I think, we've heard a lot about good faith. We've heard a lot about responsibility. And I think ethically, we know that these expenses are going to occur. And I think we have to budget for them. I think doing otherwise is irresponsible on our part.
Mr. Sini.
Technical question to Mr. Mooney. So this line about the grants, only items outside the budget that are unanticipated are eligible for reimbursement. So if we put forth a budget to the Board of Finance, and these are very hypothetical, and their answer is a different way that they want to finance, the Board of Education. Is it the voted on budget, the budget adopted by the Board of Education that would be looked upon, whether or not those funds will be applicable or could be applied? Did I make myself clear? I'm sorry if.
Yes, no, I understand the question. And with reference again to the fact that we are just making our best guess because the legislation hasn't passed, it would be the final budget adopted by the board, and say hypothetically that the response of the town bodies is, well, we're not sure these are going to be incurred, and if they are incurred, we'll cover it. That would not be trigger the supplant versus supplement, because it's not in the budget. Unless and until it's in the budget, the normal supplant supplement rules wouldn't apply, and a commitment from the town to cover it would implicitly be if it's not otherwise covered. So that would be the distinction. I hope I've answered your question.
I lost you there a little, Tom. I'm sorry. So if the Board of Education passed its budget and put it forth to the town,
yes,
would it's with these COVID expenses included, hypothetically, under the same assumptions, could the town, could we pursue those grants?
If there's a missing step in the question, because you adopt a budget and under your hypothetical, you include COVID expenses. It goes to the town and the town takes action. If the town adopts that budget or approves the appropriation for that budget, yes, then those expenses are in the budget. And if the supplant versus supplement rules that are typical apply, then you've already covered it in your budget and you would not be eligible for the grant. But if the town were to say, we're going to appropriate some lesser amount, and our rationale is that we don't know that these COVID expenses are going to be incurred, then you as a board have to adopt a new budget and reconcile the lower appropriation to your projected expenditures. And how you cover that is will determine whether you've budgeted for it or not.
Just to build on that, just a tad, just to say is that they open up Pandora's box. I'm not saying that, but Richard, you can correct me here. But if other funding through grants came through, it's not that we couldn't use it. We might be able to use it for something that we didn't budget for, and it's new and different. Okay, so I'm not opening that up, but I'm just mentioning it. That's if you're not eligible for support.
Mrs. Ackerman's had her hand up.
So can someone please name for me the federal grants that we're debating?
Well, since I've referred to it's the prospect of right now Congress is discussing a new stimulus package, and that package will come with money to certain entities with certain strings attached. That's why we can't make any final assumptions, because we just don't know what that legislation ultimately is going to say. When I'm talking about that's what I'm talking about. I would defer to others.
So, I mean, that's my concern. We're talking about a hypothetical on top of a hypothetical on top of a hypothetical grant. So if what we're going to say is we're going to rely on the money that hypothetically is going to exist somewhere, again, I'm not saying budget for a whole school year. I actually, I like that we've taken this down to 45 days because we can open schools. And I think that that's reasonable. But we are talking about, we would not budget special education this way. We wouldn't say, well, hypothetically, we might get money from somewhere, so let's put in a grant. And yet somehow on the health and safety of our children, we're saying there might hypothetically be federal funds, and so we're not going to budget for the health and safety of our children because then we wouldn't get reimbursed when there's nothing to contemplate yet. And unfortunately, this is when our budget season hits, but that's what it is. So it's a hypothetical on top of a hypothetical. And when it comes to children's health and safety and our staff's health and safety, I'm a little uncomfortable with that.
I just want to, just in terms of process wise, certainly I'm not dependent on that for budgeting for the safety, but and also all of them is sort of apprising the board. I don't want you to get down the line and someone say we could have had $500,000 eligible. It's just an appraisal.
I think the bulk of the conversation has been around understanding the actual process if that hypothetical grant came to fruition, that people thoroughly understand kind of that process. I agree. We cannot budget or go down this path of thinking there may be some type of grant, but we should understand how the grant process works, which I think a lot of the questions have been around. Mrs. Ritchie. Sorry, everyone keeps moving.
That's okay. So this question is for Tom, and it's about our process as hypothetically, we've budgeted for COVID, we approve our Board of Education budget, and we pass it to the Board of Finance, and they decide not to include those COVID expenses in our overall appropriation. They're going to fund it in a different way, let's say hypothetically through some sort of non-lapsing account. That figure of 800,000 is no longer in our appropriation. It's part of some other account. Is that still considered, and I hate to keep going down this grant process, but would those expenses then potentially be eligible for any grants since they're not included in our total appropriation?
Yes, your question raises a different issue that I just want to comment on briefly, and that is that through the appropriation process, the town body has the statutory responsibility for considering the estimate presented by the Board of Education and appropriating money accordingly. And one of the reasonable judgments the town could make is that we're not going to include that in the appropriation back to the board, and we'll deal with it if and when it comes. The complication in your question is it is disfavored for towns to say, well, we'll give you the money, but we'll put it in another account as a contingency. And there is a Supreme Court decision in Connecticut from years ago where a town tried to do that because they weren't sure whether a roof should be repaired, or actually they wanted the roof repaired. And so they said, we'll give you this money in this account to repair the roof, but we're not giving you the money otherwise. That contingent appropriation was improper. So it wouldn't be appropriate for the town to have a contingency and say, we'll give you this money if you need it from this account. It would be proper for the town to say, we're not convinced that these expenses will be incurred. And if and when they are, come back to us, and we're giving you our promise that we will cover them when they are certain. I hope that didn't complicate it unnecessarily, but I did want to draw that distinction between contingent appropriation and promises.
So in the interest of everyone's time, but specific to Mr. Mooney, I just want to do a time check for you, Mr. Mooney, and see where you're at on your availability for us.
I'm here as long as you need me, and I'm gone as soon as you don't.
Thank you, Mr. Mooney. I want to respect that. I appreciate that. Mrs. Stein.
I would just quickly say, I want to go back to the point that our administration put this RC in our budget book. They clearly had it in for a reason, right? We don't just sort of throw things in there. So I think we need to listen to that. And when you look, I'm sorry, I don't have my budget book in front of me, but I believe what you're proposing is about a third or a quarter of the original full year need for RC 28. So to me, the 45 days gets us going. We likely will have more money we're going to need, so it won't preclude us from a grant. But it gets us started and gets the right staff in place to open schools. So again, I would defer to our administration here. And again, I'm supportive.
Mrs. McCammon.
Thank you. I want to address a few things. I think that I just want to focus the conversation in a little bit in that I think that this is not really about trust between boards. It's about taxation and extraordinary circumstances. It's also not about worrying about the budget number. These are, again, extraordinary circumstances. So if the right answer is to put it in the budget, we put it in the budget. If the right answer is to go for an appropriation, we go for an appropriation. If there's a gray area and we just have to make a choice, fine. But I don't think any board member up here is looking at this as trying to hold to a number. So I just wanted to clarify that. But I want to go back to my question. Alan, and perhaps Rich, you could chime in. In order to preserve the educational experience of our kids, which again, I think every board member up here feels very strongly about, what if we were to run the appropriation timeline? I just want to understand, and making sure that we can get the staffing in place in particular. When do you need money? At what time exactly? So that you can do the necessary hiring to make this happen?
Richard, you can talk about how it comes onto the books, but we would be advertising. I would anticipate here at the end of the year, we'll be advertising for positions for these particular sections that we have, that we've delineated here. So straight away for me, Richard, if you want to talk about how it gets reported, that's fine too.
You would need support to hire those positions. You wouldn't necessarily need the funds for those positions. You would track those expenditures, potentially make transfers.
Mr. Rudel, you cut out there a little bit, and it's important everyone understands. Could you just start again? Thank you.
Sure. So similar to this year, if you were to have to add staff, you would need a commitment from the Board of Ed to hire the staff, but you wouldn't necessarily need the funds available to hire those staff members. You would have to either track it as we did this year, where there's transfers, or at some point make a supplemental appropriation. You would not run out of money really until the spring if in a similar situation to this year. So you would have to go for an appropriation if you did not have it in your budget, probably in a similar timeline to this year.
Mrs. McCammon, any follow-up?
No, thank you for asking.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Rudel. Mr. Cini.
Just one more for Tom. If we did put forth a budget and the town bodies decided not to fund that amount, do they have a line item veto on that, or would it just come back to us? And like last year, we'd have to go through every RC and figure out how to appropriate the line items.
I appreciate the question because it does provide an opportunity for guidance going forward. The town does not have a line item veto, but how the town deliberates and acts in this regard will inform the board's additional deliberation. And specifically, if the town says, well, we're cutting your request because we aren't sure that these expenses are going to be incurred, then you would then have a further decision to make. And Dr. Adley raised the very important issue of health and safety. If you are convinced that these expenses will be incurred and you don't wish to risk that outcome by hoping for a supplemental appropriation, then in your reconciliation process, you would have to change the line item expenditures and build these expenses back into the budget. However, if the understanding is clear and the board is comfortable by the town saying we're not going to fund these expenses now because we just don't know, but we don't know it's a possibility. And if those needs arise, we are saying now we will fund those, then that would inform the board's reconciliation process, and the board would decide whether to rely upon that representation and go forward without making the cuts to fund the COVID expenses within the appropriation made.
Thank you.
Dr. Adley. So that sort of completes the circle of the question that McCammon asked, because it's a wee bit different this year than last year. If there's 400,000 in staffing I got to do, I'm not going to wait till we see what happens, because I know that that's going to be an expenditure we're going to have to put out then, and I would have to pull back some of the things that are in the budget for this year, because I know that right up front if that happens. So that's just that's the completion of that answer.
Mr. Brown.
Hi, just following up on that question in the process. And Dennis's question earlier, if we put these items in the budget and move forward, and then we may go through an iterative process. But once we've included these in, that's where we risk foreclosing having a grant if it follows the previous practice of grants at the federal level, correct?
Yes, that would be driven by your final adopted budget after you know what the appropriation is.
Okay, so we could be in a situation where once we put it in, it's in, and it's at the step before it goes, it's not really what happens after in that process.
That's when the your position is locked in, but we sit here today uncertain as to whether and how the supplant versus supplement conditions would be included in any grant through the new stimulus package.
Understood. Thank you very much, Tom.
Mrs. Ockman.
So I will say, both as a former board chair and a finance committee chair, this board has a long history of not hiring staff unless that salary is encumbered. This year was different because we didn't even have the 6-foot rule until late in the summer. And so what we are saying that we would do is, if we knew we needed this staff, we would receive our appropriation in July and immediately, because we would already be advertising for the position. So we'd be advertising for positions and interviewing people for which we have not dedicated the money to. Get our appropriation and then immediately transfer almost upwards of, well, if I just look at the salary, over $400,000. To me, we hear lots of talk about transparency. That's not transparent. This past year is not the model we can go off of. And this is what I tried to say in the meeting the other day. We had to be nimble because we didn't even have CDC guidelines when we approved this budget. We now have them. They may change, and maybe we'll have to be nimble again. But the idea that we would go out and we would be interviewing and telling people we would interview them and sign contracts with them and not have the money and personnel has never been how this board has worked. And so this board would have to convene, we would have to start making immediate transfers. And I don't know, that's not particularly transparent. And I don't know, Mrs. Sion, you would actually need to advertise for jobs that we don't have approved funding for, is what I'm hearing on the schedule Dr. Adley just laid out. Please tell me if I'm wrong.
Well, I just advertise what I'm told to advertise. So I look to Rich and Alan and the board whether funds are available. I'm sorry, Tara.
Mr. Brown.
Just a quick follow-up. I don't know what would preclude us if we get to say June, July, and realize we were going to have staff, why we couldn't go to the Board of Finance then. But if we make a decision now and lock in on this, I mean, we have time before the start of the school year, consistent with this timeline, to get funding in place. We wouldn't actually have to have people in the building. So I'm not sure where that concern is if we have that option to go to the Board of Finance.
Mrs. Ritchie.
Well, I guess I just looking to Dr. Adley and Rich, because I think I'm hearing that they're pretty confident that we're going to need at least these FTEs in place to open school. And if that's not the case, then please let us know. But I think I'm hearing that we need to be able to be nimble and hire these people in July as we start to get ready for school. But if that's not the case, please let me know.
If we're estimating, as we are here, for 45 days, yes, we want to be hiring people as quickly as possible. We can't be going back, disrespectfully, we can't be going back in the middle of the hiring season to the Board of Finance to be asking them to approve stuff to hire. I respectfully think that process would be helpful. I understand the spirit of the question, but you just don't want to, listen, it's hard enough to get people. And everybody's still looking for people, so. Anyway.
Mrs. Ockman.
Sorry, so I have two questions. The first, just picking up off of that, Mrs. Sion, does the special appropriation process work in line with the hiring process?
Look, I think that would put us in a bind if we had to go for a special appropriation in July at the same time we're trying to hire people. Just the length of time it takes, I agree with Dr. Adley, would really be difficult for us.
Okay, and then secondly, if we talk about other boards, my understanding of the Board of Selectmen is that they have budgeted 25% of their expected COVID expenses. Sounds like we're doing something fairly similar. Additionally, my understanding of the latest FEMA grant did not preclude reimbursement from budgeted expenses. And I am not a grant expert nor a federal grant expert, so I could look more into that. But if we want to talk about counterparts and boards and working together, why would we not reasonably make a case to the community, the same case the Board of Selectmen are making, we can foresee, we think reasonably 25% of our costs and bring them forward and let our other elected officials contemplate that.
Thank you, Mrs. Ackman. Mrs. McCammon.
Go back to my practical question for Dr. Adley. Dr. Adley, if in an ideal world we were to use the appropriation process, exactly when would you want to have the money in the bank, and exactly when do you need it? My understanding was that we could go forward without it, as we did this year, as long as the board approved the positions, that we could, that you could go through the full hiring process. But if you would please confirm that, again, in terms of what you need and then versus what you would want. Before I ring off, also perhaps you could talk formally to the Board of Selectmen. It would be nice to know what their plan is. I do agree that this is a good time to approach this as a town, and would love to compare notes with them, please. Thank you.
Yeah, it's just a different set of circumstances we find ourselves in. I can't, in good faith, this year, if they don't support it, and you're talking about an appropriation, I got to put this at this point. For budget for the 45 days, I got to put those things to the items that we've listed here. But I can't go out and make the other expenditures, and I don't think the board's going to want me to do that, like deliberately overspend right out the door. Some of these other items that we have in the budget are not going to happen if I have to make some of the expenditures. The process itself, in terms of when we need the appropriation, would work something like it did this year. So it's later on in the year that it happened, but I wouldn't be saying, let's put in, but I don't know, pick something, okay? Facilitator, that's a popular item. I wouldn't be saying putting that in, potentially, right? And then, well, let's see if we can make it work at the end of the year when I know right away we're starting in the hole with it. That would not be responsible budget, in my opinion. Whatever the items we would be talking about. So it's just different. The appropriation would work the same, but since these are things that are health and safety, if we're going to budget them, then we need them until proven otherwise. Therefore, we can't do some other things.
Mrs. McCammon.
So just to follow up, Alan, so, this has been added to the budget with money attached. And again, I'm grateful that we're having these discussions. What were you thinking originally then when you didn't put in the budget? What would your plan have been?
I was thinking originally, like everybody else was, I didn't have a crystal ball at the time when this budget was put together. We're talking October, November, December, putting this together. I thought it would be at least responsible for the board to highlight as best I could what the year would look like in a COVID-28 expense item. But I was clear with the things in the budget that we put under the COVID. And they are, I'm not saying incidental, but they're not the scope of this. And that's not unlike some other districts who are putting a certain amount in for PPEs or so on and so forth. So that's reasonable. At that point, I thought it just responsible to put the 3 or to put forward whatever the budget is without it in pending further discussion. And in collaboration with the board, I think you've done a good thing in terms of let's highlight that, let's have a discussion about that. Is that what is fiscally responsible to do? Is that what we should be doing with the board? I think that's a healthy discussion that whatever way we got here in terms of, hey, within the vote, we should talk about this more. I think that's healthy. So I just, at that point, I felt it was just useful to highlight the things as opposed to include it in the actual budget that I'm putting forward.
Mr. Brown.
Just a question for Rich. I know we're in the midst of the process right now, the allocation, but having to go to Board of Finance for extra money is a practical matter. That hasn't affected your operations budget-wise?
It has not.
Thank you.
Any further questions or comments? Mrs. Ackman.
So I think Mrs. McCammon actually used the right term when she said she had a practical question, because there's both the practical question and the the responsibility question. So we can talk about what didn't affect operations this year. We can talk about what does or doesn't next year in the practical sense. We also need to talk about our responsibility. And so again, I go back to the idea that the statute contemplates that if we knowingly, we cannot budget knowing that we have expenses and not put them in the budget. And I don't know if anyone on this board is willing to say, and this is why the list is debatable, but I don't think the concept is debatable, that we can say we know we have no expenses, so we're not putting them in. And if someone wants to look at the practical side of this, what do you not think belongs on this list? I'm willing to entertain that, but I don't think I can knowingly vote for a budget that does not contemplate COVID expenses in the middle of a pandemic. That just is illogical to me. So for me, it goes back to that. If we want to talk about what expenses are reasonable, the duration that is reasonable, I'm open to that conversation, but I can't be pushed to the idea of, oh yeah, don't worry, we can totally open schools, but we are not budgeting for pandemic expenses.
Mr. Brown.
I just would like to say that I would take a counterpoint to that. I think that it's difficult to put forward a budget where we know we're going to, in most likelihood, shut down the possibility of getting additional funding without going to the taxpayers. My understanding from Rich is we've not affected the operations of the school in hiring or any other fashion as we've gone through this process with the Board of Finance. And also, this is a number that was not in the original budget. There were some numbers, but this came in on Tuesday and has been coming in very late in the budget process after public comment. And I don't think we should lose the fact of the perspective of when this was introduced. Thank you.
So Mr. Mooney, just with respect to all the good conversation here, and we're getting a little bit into the accounting, which is Rich's world, as to cash on hand and our ability to pay bills and hire teachers, which we have the ability to do through a board process when we get our appropriation in July. But I think to some members' points, if we reasonably build into the budget those expenses which we think we can realize based on being in a pandemic, and then do not include other expenses that come to light and we go through the appropriation process, are we doing anything that really affects our responsibility to building the right type of budget, being that we are in a crystal ball forecasting out 8 months? But there's certain things that I think we can get our arms around that we'll need to open the schools.
I think that's a fair description of exactly where you are. That is a reasonable judgment. In other words, you look at the crystal ball and you say, along a continuum, we can't imagine not needing these services. We're not so sure, and it's possible if things get bad, you go to the other extreme. So as part of your deliberation, it certainly is reasonable for you to make those distinctions. And that doesn't mean you're excluding from consideration possible future expenses. You're just saying that as we estimate, we're not going to include those because the probabilities along a continuum don't warrant including those expenses in our budget, and we have a process for seeking those funds otherwise. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Mooney. Mr. Maroney.
Yeah, to comment on Mrs. Ockman's point, I think we're at the point in this meeting where, and I'm not, excuse me from my question though, is has this RC, the entirety of the RC, been put on the add drop list, or do we need to go through and signify items of this RC that we wish to propose for Tuesday night?
Mrs. Ockman.
So if we go back to the budget process, we meet on that super session. We hear everything the administration has, we hear public comment. We've had another meeting where we discussed all the RC. Special meeting.
You're cutting out, Mrs. Ockman. You might have to repeat yourself a little bit.
Well, I'm just going through the budget process because it surprises me that we have to keep doing this, and we did it the other night as well. So the answer really is that the add cut night, and that's why that night is so important, and it keeps being stressed even in our public comment. This was put up. Mrs. Ritchie and I made clear that we were putting up this RC. It wasn't a mystery. So yes, Dennis, this RC is up.
Mrs. Ritchie.
Thanks, and I'll just reiterate that throughout our discussions, beginning with Super Saturday, I have been addressing COVID. I keep talking about my light switch. And I made my concerns known very early on that we weren't budgeting for COVID. And I did not put anything on Tuesday. I did it when everybody else did, except for the one. And I did it a week and a half ago when it was appropriate to do it. And I just want to make sure that that process is clear, that this isn't new. I've been talking about it for the past month or so. And I just feel like I wanted to make sure that everybody was aware that this isn't new. It didn't come up Tuesday night. I have been talking about it for at least a month.
Mrs. McCammon.
This is just a request for Rich. If possible, Rich, can you help us understand when we come back on Tuesday night whether there are items on that list that would likely be or would be unlikely to be covered by the grant? Again, I do appreciate that that's a hypothetical question whether or not we'll receive a grant, but I think it would be helpful to understand if we have items that fall on either side of that. Thank you.
Rudel, is there a quick answer to that as to what's included in the current grant? I don't think we can guess what would be included or excluded in a hypothetical future grant.
So based on the restrictions on ESSER 1 and ESSER 2, the one item that will likely not be able to be submitted is the YMCA cost should we have to pay for swimming, because
you cut out, Mr. Rudel.
So based on the restrictions of the current ESSER grants, assuming those were the same restrictions going forward, the charge to the YMCA for girls swimming is something that would likely not be reimbursable.
But everything else really falls into the world of being reimbursable once you submit it.
Everything else at least fits into the categories that have been outlined in previous grants.
Does that answer your question, Mrs. McCammon?
It does. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mrs. Ritchie.
I just want to formally request that all of the items that the superintendent has detailed in his memo now appear on our ad cut list for Tuesday night. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Ritchie. Mr. Cini.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have the current ad cut list, but I'm trying to no one's been able to opine on the dollar amount that was just presented to us yesterday. I realize the line items were there, but the dollar amount has been shifting dramatically over the last, I guess, what are we talking, 4 or 5 days. So, and we're talking big dollars. So that hasn't been presented to the public. I know the line items are there, and I'm happy that somebody requested to verify these line items.
So, Mr. Cini, is there any further conversation or questions you want to have around those particular line items or the dollar amounts today?
I guess my request, and again, I want to be in proper process, but I want to ensure that what is being presented today in this memo, I want to see it in the ad cut list, I guess, is what I'm saying. It's 826,000 in that Excel file that has been shared with all of us.
So So, Mr. Rudel, can we update the ad cut list? And then I think to get the big picture too, we have to look at the percentage impact of what the budget looks like with these dollars in it.
And again, I just want to reiterate, no one in the public has been able, not even our public, other elected bodies have been able to opine now if this is integrated to the ad cut list, into the ad cut list now. So I also, for proper procedure, we're going to have to open up another public comment period. Not public comment, public hearing, actually. That maybe that should go.
Thank you, Mr. Cini. Mrs. Ackman.
So again, guys, we're not reinventing the wheel here, but really what should have happened the other night, which has always happened, is the administration comes forward with recommendations. They should have been on the top of the ad cut list. They shouldn't have been a separate item. People put up ideas and concept. Mrs. Ritchie and I have been talking about this since when was the Super Saturday? January 4th. When the ad cut list came up and it was out, at the top of that page should have been administrative recommendations based on board member feedback. So what should really happen now, if we're going to follow all the process we followed for lots of years, is if this is the administration's recommendation, it should be in the top of the ad cut list. Board members should receive it saying, these are the cuts that the board recommended. These are what the administration is recommending in relation to those. And then we discuss it from there. We go line by line. I mean, all you have to do is go back and watch an old video or talk to any one of the members who have done this for years. We were more than willing to help you if there's confusion. But that way we're not reinventing processes, adding public hearings. Like, there's a script. We do this so it's predictable. We heard all the people today say that they're upset that they haven't had time to opine. We have got to get back into process.
Thank you, Mrs. Akman. Any further questions or comments? Mrs. Parent?
Is the ad cut list available to the public? Like, I don't know that the public has actually seen, unless you're watching meetings and taking notes. Is that posted?
Yeah, the ad cut list should be posted, yes, and the one that this morning should be posted also. Or it's not an ad cut this morning; it's the itemized list.
Yeah, we don't have a.
But it should be posted.
Is there any further conversation from the board on what is on this list that the administration has presented?
So sorry, Duke, now I'm a little confused. So the administration now is adopting this as a formal recommendation to the board, this list that we just got this morning?
Yes.
Well, can we be pragmatic here a little bit? I mean, we're all coming to the terms of COVID and it's coming to the table. Look, you're asking me to go back, do what I have to do, meet with people. That takes me a long time to do. The people that are most informed to give me it. And I'm getting it turned around to you as quickly as we can. So I would just recognize we've got COVID on the ad cut list. This is a refined list. You can argue whether it should have been refined in the first place, like 12 months in advance. But we're in this together, like sort of working through it as best we can. And your administrative team is doing everything it can to be responsive to it and be bringing forward as best an estimate. I don't care where it fits in what process in terms of, I do actually, but COVID is on the list. COVID is on the ad cut list. We've gone back to our professionals. We've asked them, this is now our best estimate to keep our kids and staff safe for the first 45 days of school. So can we just come to terms of like putting it on and those that are having the discussions, like, I mean, ultimately have to discuss whether we're going to actually do the ad cut, do the COVID list or whether we're not. So, and then we'll probably go through those line items. But
so I think we have to the question, Mr. Sini, and to Dr. Adley, we have what's been presented by board members that is on the ad cut list. And then we will update that list with the additions that the administration has recommended. Does that make sense for everyone?
Yeah, and Duke, just for, again, first of all, Dr. Ali, I wasn't assailing or criticizing the administration. This has been a really fluid situation in a very short time period. I just, for proper process, I want to make sure that the numbers that were presented by the administration are now integrated into that list. And again, I thank you and Rich for all the work. Please don't take it. I just want to make sure that in a transparent manner, now the public and our other elected officials can see this, which we're gravitating to. And lastly, Duke, I'm not ready to opine on this specific list because literally, I think we got it a couple of days ago, or no, maybe even yesterday as part of the agenda. So I need at least a weekend to kind of digest it. Okay.
Fair enough. Thank you. Mrs. Ritchie.
So since my items were on the ad cut list and a lot of the items presented by Dr. Adley are already part of our ad cut list, I would say you can go ahead and replace mine with yours, Dr. Adley, but I do agree with Tara, and this is the way it historically has been done in the past. Since these are now administrative recommendation, I do believe that they should be appearing separately and on top of the ad cut list. Historically, we have had administration cuts and ads that come forth during the process. We haven't seen that this year, but now that we do have these, I would request and agree with Ms. Ockman that they need to appear at the top of the list as administrative recommended ads to the budget. And these items were on my ad cut list, and there was opportunity to discuss them. And if people have questions about the new things that were added by administration, I would welcome anytime questions now, or if you don't have the ability to opine at this point, then I guess we could discuss it on Tuesday when we meet.
So just to be clear, that where the ad cut list starts with RC 28, I'll insert these as administrative block of administrative recommendations. Is that okay? Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry, I'll just, historically, Alan, what we've done, and it may be worth you and Rich going back and looking at a one pre-COVID, the administration has their block at the top, and it's usually a different color, and then it's ours. And through the process, over the years, there have been things where you've realized savings and you realize you won't need something. And so those have appeared at the top. And then we've separated out, and then you have the board ads and cuts. So if you could put it at the top and separate it out, and that's generally how we do it.
And I'll just add that I do think it's important to make that distinction so the public understands the board members did put forward some cuts and ads, but these are administrative ads to the budget.
Thank you, Mrs. Ritchie. So then, Mr. Rudel, this will be part of that spreadsheet that you have, that as we go through the process, it'll show the percentage increase in terms of the budget.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So again, do proper process. Will we have to have another public hearing on this now that well, I want to confirm, Dr. Adley, are you now adopting this as an administrative ad cut? And then secondly, Duke, if that is true, do we have to have another public hearing on the matter?
So if that's the way, the board certainly respectfully puts it on, so that we get the question on the table about how we cover it in the first 45 days, yes. I don't think that someone can share with me about the year. I don't think it's a mess.
Sorry.
This is
no. This was on the ad cut list. It was up for discussion at the public hearing. You are making adjustments to RC 28. Am I correct, Alan? RC 28 is in the budget book. Correct. Your adjustments, you're adjusting from a full school year to 45 days for the most part, save the salaries, which are yearly. So in my opinion, we don't need a public hearing on this matter. It's already been up. There are cuts there. They could have made comments on it. That whole RC was up for comment given Mrs. Ockman and Mrs. Ritchie's ads and cuts.
I think for the most part, all the line items you presented are line items that Mrs. Ockman or Mrs. Ritchie have presented through the process. Mrs. Ockman.
So again, I would agree with Mrs. Stein. No, RC 28 was on the cut list. Anyone could speak to it. They could say add to it, make it less, make it more, whatever they'd like. Administrative recommendations are different. If we're not calling for a public hearing for new ads on RCs that never appeared on, I'm not sure why we would call for something that was on the ad cut list. Like, we have to have some consistency, guys. I know how hard everyone.
You keep cutting in, Mrs. Ockman.
Sorry, and I know I seem frustrated today, and I'm not usually this frustrated or testy at a meeting, but like, we can't just reinvent all the rules. So RC 28 was on the ad cut list with different proposals by both me and Mrs. Ritchie. The administration has now come back with a proposal. We're discussing it at a special meeting. We will discuss it Tuesday night. That's the process. And if we're going to call for a public hearing on anything, we better be calling for things that were never on the ad cut list.
I'm not calling for it. I just wanted to ask a question, make sure.
Thank you for the clarity, and through the discussion and the knowledge of the board members, I think we got to the right place. Thank you all. Any additional questions or comments? Right. Mr. Mooney, anything you would like to add to our conversation?
No, I think your consideration of these issues was thorough, and you have a good handle on the decisions you have to make.
Thank you, Mr. Mooney. Anything, Dr. Adley, you'd like to add?
No, thank you for everybody's time, sir. No.
Okay. Thank you all. May I have a motion to adjourn?
Second.
Mrs. Stein and Mr. Brown, meeting is adjourned. Thank you all. Thank you all who participated from the public. And Mr. Mooney, thank you very much.